Thank you for auditing Professor Skye's Record Review, the always positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who today will be reviewing McCartney III. And it might be a little bit unexpected. You know, I am an academic, an actual professor of French and all that fancy snooty literature stuff, but I am also somebody who enjoys the sport of fantasy baseball. And there's a weird thing that happens in fantasy baseball where a lot of the analysts and the specialists talk about a player, and especially older players. As they get older, they sometimes seem as though they've lost a certain skill that they have. But there's like this dictum that exists in fantasy sports and in sports in general. Once a player displays a skill, they always have it. So even if their skills decline, even if they're getting older, like if they have a particular kind of intelligence in a certain area of the game, the ability to take walks, the ability to be a good base runner, etc., like they always have that skill. So I think that's what we always have to keep in mind in art as well. When we think of Paul McCartney, we think of the Beatles, we think of all these important songs, the most influential living musician on planet Earth, right? And he is making an album. Every time he makes an album, the question always kind of comes into your mind, like, does he still have it? And if he doesn't still have it, when did he lose it? And if he does still have it, what exactly does he have? Because it's not the Beatles, he's not in the White Album, he's not in Rubber Soul. Where is he? So one of my favorite stories about Paul McCartney, it's an anecdote, but I think it tells a lot about what makes him an interesting figure. He constantly tries to work with people who are young and interesting, right? And that's why he worked with Michael Jackson in the 80s, and that's why he worked with Kanye a couple years ago. But apparently he asked Tom York, Tom, would you like to work with me? And Tom York said no. And I love the story for a lot of reasons. One, it's not like Tom York hates Paul McCartney, but he just didn't see the reason. Like he saw this collaboration and thought, I don't really want to do it. But it makes me wonder, like what must it be like to be an artist like Paul McCartney? Like, how do you maintain relevance when you are still the most influential living artist? Okay, I mean, if John Lennon were alive, they'd be sharing that title, but he gets to have that title by himself. Like, how do you exist? How do you go from day to day? How do you make an album? What's interesting is that story about Tom York and about working with Kanye, you might think that there's a part of him that's desperate to maintain, like I reviewed his last album when I first started this channel. Maybe don't watch it, it's probably not very good. But I talked about his orange hair, like why is this very famous person making his hair so obviously dyed? Like, what is he like a sad aging hipster trying to hold on, or is he not? I think it's pretty clear that he's not. And what I love about this album is what I've loved about McCartney I and McCartney II. I think that these three albums are solo Paul McCartney at their best. And I think perhaps it's because I can relate to them. Now, I can't relate to being a musical genius, but I can relate to recording a lot of music by myself. I did that with a 4-track 20 years ago, I do it with a computer now, and there's this certain mentality that overcomes you when you're making music by yourself. Very few artists are able to make albums entirely by themselves and make works of transcendent beauty. Like Tame Impala is able to do that, right? The Slow Rush is that. I would say McCartney I, II, and III, none of them are works of transcendent beauty and amazing artistry. I wouldn't. But at the same time, they're great. And it's really the expression, I think, of an artist who's like Paul McCartney, who is still trying to stay in touch, still trying to be important, but who also has a sense of humor about himself and just enjoys kind of messing around. That's the similarity that I see between Paul McCartney I from 1970, Paul McCartney II from 80, and in this one from 2020. He's like too rich to care what happens to him, right? He's too rich, too successful. He's achieved everything he could possibly achieve before he was 25, right? But he has all this talent and he has a desire to put out music. But yet, is this a burning desire? Is this a need? Does Paul McCartney wake up on fire to release this music? I wouldn't say that he does either. That's what makes him as an artist so vexing, so hard to vexing, what a stupid word, so complex to figure out. Because much of this album and much of his solo work in general feels like they're ditties for his own fun. And even if you read the interviews around this album, he talks about just doing things for his own fun. I think that if we could look at the Paul McCartney discography and we could take one moment to be the sort of guiding force behind Paul McCartney's solo, I think we might say it's Obla Di Obla Da. Now, one of my least favorite Beatles songs, but it's a silly song, it's a fun song, it's a great song, right? I mean, it's not one of my favorite Beatles songs, but it's one of my favorite songs because their music is so good. But I think that kind of like sort of throwaway lyrics and interesting music and kind of messing around with sounds and just sort of having fun and not making music out of that artistic burning desire, slitting your wrist, Vincent van Gogh, but more just like, be fun to make a song today. And he gets up and he's able to do it. And he's able to make it all by himself, and all of it has this interesting feel to it. Even McCartney 1, which is, it might be my favorite Beatles solo album, even more than All Things Must Pass, even more than Ringo's first album, definitely more than anything John ever recorded. Even that, like, there's this weird like lack of polish to McCartney 1, 2, and 3, which is just delightful. I mean, somebody who is a Sir, a Knight of the Realm, and a billionaire, right? That he makes these albums, and even this McCartney 3, it's kind of rough around the edges. It doesn't feel totally finished. And I think that's on purpose. I think that's the immediacy of this, and this album that only Paul McCartney can make. So whether or not this is great or just good, it's definitely good, right? It's not bad. This is not a bad album. Whether or not it's great or it's good, it's something which only he could make. Only someone of his stature, of his talents, and of his perspective, and of just his obla-di-bla-danis. I would say that part of what makes his music interesting as well, and part of what makes him such a likable figure to me, right? I mean, most people prefer John, right? Because he's the artist and the jerk, and he had a cooler voice, and he was kind of the cool guy, and Paul was the cute guy. And Paul was the family man. And that was always the strike kind of against him in the hippie era, you know, that he just sort of sold out and got a family and had a whole thing. But to me, that's the charm of him, you know, that music isn't actually the most important thing in his life. At least that's not the sense that I get, or that I've got, right? And how could it be that you are the most successful living person in a certain field, and that field, you know, your value does not derive from your success in that field? Sorry, the heating just went on. I have to cover up the vent with the dog bed, which is going to mean that there's going to be a dog smell coming up this way, but fortunately you can't smell that here. So I really love this album. I love the sort of symmetry of it. The photo of him on the back cover is the same little girl that was in his jacket on McCartney 1. This real sense of family. Apparently he recorded it with her and her family just kind of around while he was in lockdown. This is a COVID album. This is another great COVID album of someone just making music just because they can. It is actually a perfect counterpoint to Taylor Swift's album. You know, like one artist who's at her absolute peak and you know, riding the train of the highest possible success, and then another artist who's at the end of their career, end of their life, who's still doing a similar thing. Like, let's just make an album. Let's just get it out there. So I kind of go through track by track. Like I said, I do definitely enjoy this. I think I enjoy it the least of the three. I really like McCartney 2. It is goofy as hell, but I kind of love that. I did make a video about why Wonderful Christmas Time is my favorite Christmas song. And it's partly because I just love that Paul McCartney just found all these new instruments and was just like, what would happen if I did this? And just is playing. Just a genius goofing around with different sounds and seeing what happens. So there's a real kind of experimental, oddball nature to McCartney 2, which is why I find it so charming. But 3 has a little bit of that too, but is a little bit more self-serious. McCartney 3 is a lot more about like the end of your life and passing on wisdom and the nature of seasons changing, and I'll go through track by track here. The first track, Longtailed Winter Bird, is sort of the entire album in one. It's a great, cool guitar line to start off. Eventually the drums come in. Paul McCartney might be the best not drummer in rock and roll, right? Because he's not a drummer, but I just love the way he drums. I love the way he tunes his drums like he's just playing pillows. You know, they're so muted, and he just is so good at finding the backbeat. I don't know if it's because he's a bass player, but he is such a good drummer. I love it when he drums, and his drumming is just great on here. But at the same time, the song kind of feels like a jam. Like he starts playing a recorder at a certain point. That's the kind of thing I would do when I was recording songs on my 4-track. Hey, what's this thing? Quick, quick, quick. Cool, I'll put this on the track. There aren't really words. Do you miss me? Do you miss me? Again, I don't think Paul McCartney has anything to say. Not really. But I think there's a freedom in that. I don't know. It's a weird thing to say, but I think there's a freedom in him not having anything to say. The next track, Find My Way, is a little bit more of a structured song. He's doing a lot of sort of like almost Brian May, Queen-like guitar stuff throughout this album, like really high harmonizing notes. Very, very boring cliche lyrics. I know my left from right. According to the credits, he plays bass, Moog bass, Moog was the hockey player, Moog was the keyboardist. So a synth bass, his Hofner bass, and the Moog bass, like he's playing all different kinds of bass. He harmonizes with himself, still not really saying anything yet. Although it does appear to be about being plagued by anxiety, but is this about him or is this about somebody else? I think it's about somebody else. Paul McCartney does not come across as somebody who has anxiety at all. He does repeat the weak chorus a little bit too many times, but there's a nice kind of instrumental outro. The next track, Pretty Boys, is one of the 2 songs in a row where the lyrics are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, is this like about his granddaughters like running into like boys and like some kind of weird jealousy over your family members dating? I mean, we know that he was very uncomfortable with his dogs mating in the 70s, but like I can't quite figure out what this song is about, which is nice because it at least makes it seem like he's saying something, even if he isn't. I can't quite tell. Great guitar work on here. Next track, Women and Wives. Again, another bizarre song, women and wives, husbands and lovers. This, he sort of he kind of slips into the sage mode. I'm 78 years old and I'm going to tell you what life is all about. And everyone is chasing tomorrow, which he will actually come back later to in reference with Seize the Day. Laboratory Lil is the temporary secretary of McCartney III. Just a silly song. It seems to be about like, look out for witchy women, that kind of thing. Not a particularly great track. The next one is probably my favorite track on the album, Deep, Deep Feeling. He's in his wonderful Christmas time place. Sonic exploration, he is goofy and he is weird. My favorite time for Paul McCartney solo is when he is weird. Lots of silence and staccato beats. He harmonizes with himself at the end. He sings in a kind of like soulful falsetto. And the lyrics are quite interesting. Here it feels like he maybe is actually saying something about the pain of feeling, the difficulty of actually having emotions, which is great. And then he kind of like jams with himself and just says, stay and go away. Comes back again. This is a very kind of self-indulgent song because the song's like 8 minutes long and there's only like 2 or 3 ideas in it. But still, he jams and he comes back and plays the song again in a much more straightforward way. So I'm going to reverse and say it's not self-indulgent, just say it was a good idea because he played through the idea through multiple experiments and ideas with how to play with the sonic landscape, and then he comes back and just does it straight. The next track is called Slidin', and this reminds me of one of the weirdest things about Paul McCartney. There's a character on Star Wars called Prune Face, and he's this like weird looking dude with a face that looks like a prune. And when you played with him as a kid, you just assumed he was one of the bad guys at Jabba's palace. Only when you're an adult do you learn that he was actually a good guy fighting for the rebels. There's a Beatles song called Helter Skelter. Only when you're an adult can you understand that Paul McCartney wrote Helter Skelter. How is like one of the beginning songs of heavy metal, this terribly angsty, angry, awesome, gnarly song written by the cute one? It's one of the most incongruous things. That was the word I was searching for earlier. One of the most, when I said vexing, I meant incongruous. It's one of the most incongruous things about Paul McCartney. It's that he wrote Helter Skelter. Like he just had that in his pocket. Like that's not him. That's not how he feels. But just, here. I'm also going to make Long and Winding Road, the only unarguably terrible Beatles song. But also, again, when he's goofing around, when he's sonically interesting, he's fascinating. So this track, Slidin', reminds you that he wrote Helter Skelter. Lots of distortion, a super hard riff, great drums that go in and out of sync. The lyrics are kind of interesting. I'm sliding, gliding through air. I can see my body through windows in my hair. It's weird to be reminded of his hair. By the way, I saw an interview with him, and his hair is gray now, and he looks great. Eventually, I'm going to lose my hair. I'm going to go gray or something, and just looks much better. And there's a great guitar solo in here as well. Next track, Kiss of Venus. Very good. Like this whole middle section of the album is very strong, very good. Apparently these lyrics are all about some astrology book he's reading. In the sunshine, we stand alone, we come together when our secrets are blown, and the kiss of Venus, and the circle is harmonious, but still is a great guitar line, which he echoes with his voice. And here, he lets his voice be a little bit ragged, like a little bit worn out. And Paul McCartney doesn't usually let himself do that. And he is a lot older. I mean, I was listening to this at breakfast this morning with the kids. My daughter goes, "Does Paul McCartney smoke?" I was like, well, I think he did for a little while, but I don't think he smoked for very long. Oh, because his voice doesn't sound the same. It's like, yeah, you get older and your voice gets a little bit weaker. He actually uses that in this song. Seize the Day shows him going back into his sage mode, talking about being wrong and right and the way to live life. And it sounds a little Jeff Lynne for my tastes, or the kind of Brian May guitar as well. The drums, though, again, awesome drums. The best not drummer in rock and roll. Who else is there, by the way? Could you please put in comments? I mean, Steven Tyler's a great drummer, but he never drums on any tracks, right? Like, who are the great non-drumming drummers? Really cool bridge on this song, and apparently, I read an interview with him, this is just a COVID song. Just seize the moment. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying. Let's appreciate the day that we live on. And again, if we tie that into the song before about everyone's living for the morrow, let's live for the day. It's kind of cheesy, carpe diem, kind of a cheesy message, but it's a good song. Then Deep Down is a very kind of low-key track. This is the lyrics on here are so repetitive and so boring that I just wish they were in a different language because the song itself is really cool. It's got a really nice groove, but he just repeats it over and over again. He adds really nice synthesizer horn sounds. If you see in the back, this is one of my family's original cells from Yellow Submarine. There's Paul McCartney playing, I guess, the tuba as a member of Sgt. Pepper's. That's why I put that back there. I really like the cool synthesizer horn sounds, kind of almost like gospel singing in the back, and he harmonizes with himself over and over again, want to get deep down. I think this is nice because this reminds me a fair amount of that deep, deep feeling where he's like trying to use this word deep and find something important. With an album that's often kind of like superficial and kind of on the surface, it does seem as though he's at least looking for depth. He does a little vocal alone, and then he does a little MJ whoo at the end, which is kind of funny. He wraps up the album perfectly with the track When Winter Comes, which is, I think, Winter Bird comes right before it. For some reason, it is co-produced by George Martin, who's been dead for 5 years. If you are a Macca head, why is this song co-produced by George Martin? I mean, the credits for this album are hilarious, because it's just, guitar Bugs Bunny, bass Bugs Bunny, drums Bugs Bunny, harmonium Bugs Bunny. Everything just says Paul McCartney, Paul McCartney, Paul McCartney, Paul McCartney. There's even one where it says associated performer Paul McCartney. It's like he's the only performer. And they list also the studio personnel. So just 3 people went into making this album. Paul McCartney played every note. Great, good for him. It's awesome. I love it. But then why does George Martin get a producing credit here? This is very nice, though, because it forms a circle with the beginning of the album, which starts off in a similar acoustic mode. This is maybe the nicest songwriting on the whole album. Just a guitar and his voice, a reminder of how good his voice is. The whole thing's about summer being gone. There's a track on McCartney II about the summer. There might be some kind of seasonal thing when you get older, feeling you're in the winter of your years. I don't know. His voice is at its best and most haunting. Very nice guitar playing. It's not really that ostentatious, and this ending really makes the whole album just work. The whole thing ends up just being this beautiful circular album, this little piece of non-urgent music. Wonderful, well-made, and yes, of course, Paul McCartney still has it. But what is it? I don't know. I'm just glad he's still doing it. Okay, well, I am probably not going to go sledding again. I just went sledding, speaking of winter. I went last night and then I went again today, and so we have like a little hill in our backyard, so I was able to get like nice and padded down, so I went super fast and almost went into our creek. I have kind of a Paul McCartney living situation over here. Although in this song, actually, this When Winter Comes, he talks all about having a farm and having to like feed the goats and water the carrots and stuff. So that is also a sort of another theme that goes back throughout Paul McCartney's solo career of like, I'm a happy family guy. I have a garden. Don't need animals. Okay, well, for John Lennon, there's the camera.